Kenny Pickett is one of the hardest quarterbacks to evaluate in the NFL because he has just 1 year of play in the pros compared to 27 years in college. And the contrast between him and Trubisky on the very same Steelers team is very stark, as Trubisky was third in average depth of target out of every quarterback in the NFL. And conversely, Pickett was 23rd. So the offense was far more conservative with Pickett, and you could say that that is a knock on Pickett, that maybe he wasn't good enough with throwing deep downfield, and they had to play the short game with him more. Or you could also say that Matt Canada is not a great offensive coordinator, and Mike Tomlin likes to play very conservatively, and that was really the root of their direction. So it's really hard to say. What we can say, though, is by most metrics, Pickett was okay, but he definitely wasn't spectacular, as according to expected points added, which, if you don't know what that stat means, I have a video that explains it in good detail. Pickett was 24th out of 37 quarterbacks that took 200 or more snaps last year, which, for context, Trubisky was 19th. So Trubisky was, according to this stat at least, better than Pickett was last year. And there's some validity to that. Pickett was really rough according to the basic counting stats, such as yards and touchdowns to interceptions. But to be fair to him, a lot of the interceptions were just kind of bad luck, as he didn't have a tremendous turnover-worthy play percentage, so he wasn't necessarily playing dangerously. It was just anytime there was a ball up for grabs, it went the defense's way. Moving to their offensive line, they receive a ton of criticism for a line that's actually not bad, because according to PFF, they were 14th in pass blocking and 16th in run blocking, so they're pretty much dead average. And anytime I hear their offensive line get talked about, it's like they're some grievous, awful line that can't do anything correctly, which I just don't think is accurate. When you look at their players as well, they're a case where the sum is kind of a little bit better than the parts, because they don't have anybody that is really an issue. And that's especially the case now after they've made the offseason addition of Isaac Samalu from the Eagles, which was a great addition in my mind. To start out, they have one of the most average tackle duos you'll ever see in Chukwuma Okorafor and Dan Moore. One of them is going to be replaced, likely, by the rookie in Broderick Jones out of Georgia, who was a first-round pick and was a pretty sound consensus first-round pick, so it wasn't like a reach of a first to upgrade the position. It was somebody that was pretty well established in the first. Either way, though, both Okorafor and Dan Moore are pretty darn similar. They're both adequate pass protectors and not very good in the run game. And then on the interior, they actually have a pretty good inside line, because James Daniels is a pretty premier guard. He's not necessarily elite, but I would say he's probably a second tier of guard, because he's a really good pass protector and he's okay in the run game. Then they obviously have Samalu, as I mentioned. He's really great as a pass protector and he's really good as a run blocker, so he's very nice to have. Then at center, they have Mason Cole, solid at both aspects of the game. So it's pretty well-rounded offensive line. And they now have Kevin Dotson as a backup, which is solid, because if anybody gets hurt, Dotson is a pretty premier backup lineman, as he's a really solid pass blocker and is not an issue in the run game either. So he'll be able to fill in just fine for basically anybody on the interior. Shifting to their wide receivers, they have a wide range of talent, And for me, it starts with George Pickens, who was third on their team in yards per game, but was eighth in the league in yards per reception, which is even more impressive with us knowing that the Steelers don't pass deep downfield for much of the season with Pickett at the helm. So Pickens was really doing it the hard way, and he was getting it in very limited samples of deep balls. So he is just really proficient when they do pass deep downfield, and he has limitless potential. He is an athletic freak, and he has already shown that he can hang in the NFL. So he's just going to keep getting better and better. I would say Deontay Johnson, though he led the team in yards per game, is probably going to be their number 2 this year. And that's really not a dig at Johnson. Johnson is a receiver you can feel pretty comfortable with in being about 1,000 yard per year type of guy. And he is a nice contrast to Pickens, because Pickens is pretty much just a athletic beast that will fight the ball off from you. And he's not too much of a route runner. He's not very refined in that regard yet. But Johnson is one of the best route runners in all of football, even if he doesn't really get credit for it. His main issue is he still doesn't have the most consistent of hands, but basically every other part of being a receiver, he's exceptional at. And if he just can tighten up his catching just a little bit, he really could be a premier receiver in this league. The Steelers' third option is a very exciting one, as Pat Freiermuth is one of the best young tight ends in all of football, and he has just really blossomed as a receiving option, because though the Steelers are not a very good passing offense, he was 6th among tight ends in yards per game, and he also had a healthy yards per reception, as he was at 11.6 yards per reception, which is a great number for a tight end, especially in an offense, again, where it's just a lot of shallow passes. So he is efficient when he gets the ball, and there's more to the offense than just Freiermuth as the third option, because Allen Robinson was a really sneaky move the Steelers made as a low-risk, high-reward type of acquisition, where they bought as low as possible on Robinson. Robinson just had an awful year with the Rams, and it looks like his career has just kind of tumbled due to injuries. But for the Steelers, they have a bit of hope, because Robinson, for not being good this past season, did have a fair amount of success in the slot. And it just so happens that the Steelers have 2 great outside receivers, and they don't really have a bona fide slot option. So Robinson can fit right in, and he may be still having some gas in the tank, and he could be a good option for them moving forward. To round out their weapons, the Steelers have a really impressive running back duo, as Najee Harris may actually be their number 2 running back at this point, which may sound blasphemous, but Jaylen Warren was really getting after it in his reps, and what really has separated them is Najee is tremendously talented, but he sometimes lets that get in the way, and will sometimes try to be a little bit too finesse and do too much with the ball instead of just going full speed ahead and charging forward, which is kind of what you need to do. Again, the Steelers have an average offensive line, so there's not really going to be a ton of time to break dance behind the offensive line, and that's what Warren gets. Is he is just all gas, no break, and that kind of works out better for the offensive line. So Warren is an exceptional number 2, if nothing else, and Harris is a very talented number 1. So they have a good problem on their hands, where they have a ton of talent at their disposal, and that just is the case all the way through, because I didn't even mention Darnell Washington, who was a fantastic pick for the Steelers. He fell to the 3rd round strictly based on medical concerns. It could not have been anything else because Washington is 6'6" and runs a 4.64 40. He is incredibly athletic. He blocks like an offensive lineman, but is fast enough to be a true tight end. So the Steelers have a embarrassment of riches on the offensive side of the ball, and I don't think it's really recognized just how good their offense is, because they weren't putting up good numbers, but a lot of that was not the greatest quarterback play and pretty poor offensive coordinating. Moving over to the defensive side, Patrick Peterson, even though he's pretty old at this point, has had several good seasons in a row, and he just remains consistently good regardless of the scheme he's in. So he's a solid number one. I would feel pretty safe in relying on. Levi Wallace is a good number two. He's pretty darn solid at this point, I would say. He's been good for Buffalo and for the Steelers now. And then their nickel is going to be Chandon Sullivan, who is a replacement level player, I would say. He is not in the same mold of Mike Hilton or Cam Sutton. I would say there's a pretty steep drop off between Sullivan and either of those players, but he's all right. He's going to get picked on, I would say, pretty often out of any of these corners. He's the easiest one to attack, but the hope is Joey Porter Jr. will show enough and be able to either play in the slot or force Wallace into the slot, in which case then this corner room looks a lot more exciting because Joey Porter Jr. has a ton of athletic potential. He's big and he's fast, and he can learn behind Patrick Peterson because he's not quite as fast as Peterson was when he was younger, but he's in that same type of mold. Porter Jr. is 6'2", and Peterson is 6'1", so very similar size. And Porter Jr., he is super physical already, so if Peterson and the coaching staff are able to help him refine just a little bit and not get called for holding, which is an issue for a lot of young corners because in college you can get away with more than you can in the pros, Porter Jr. is going to be really exciting. They also have a great lottery ticket in Corey Trice, who was a 7th round pick. So you may be wondering why I'm even talking about him. 7th round picks are very rarely good, but he is an athletic specimen. He's 6'3" and ran sub 4.5 for his 40 time. He is just an athletic monster, and he could very easily be somebody I see a few years from now being a solid contributor to their defense. As far as the safeties go, you got to start with Minkah Fitzpatrick. He is a top 5 safety, no doubt about it at this point. Probably the best true free safety in football, which I don't want to besmirch him by saying true free safety. He can also play like a strong safety in the box as well. But I would say he is best as a more covering safety, and that's hopefully where he'll play for this year. In years past, when the Steelers didn't have the greatest of run defenses, it forced Minkah to play closer to the line of scrimmage, and there was a bit of a drop-off in his play in that case. But with Keanu O'Neal, they have somebody that is a bona fide box safety. Even though he's not the greatest player, he can play in the box really nicely. And they also have DeMonte KZ, who has really not played too much throughout his career at this point, but has always been a solid option. So he is a really good safety number 2 to have. And yeah, I think their defensive back room is pretty sneaky good. I don't think it's going to be an issue. I don't think it's going to be a major driving force for the Steelers' success either, but I don't think it's going to be very problematic, which is a little bit of a hot take, I would say. Pivoting to their front 7 now, the Steelers have a monstrous defensive line, And it's really up to you if you want to start with Cam Hayward or TJ Watt, because though TJ Watt just won Defensive Player of the Year 2 seasons ago, Cam Hayward is, I would say, still about as important to the success of the Steelers as Watt is, because Hayward just completely controls the line of scrimmage in both the run and passing game. And for context, Hayward was 20th out of all players, meaning edges included, in pressures this past season. And he's doing that as somebody that is always double teamed. So he is a fantastic player that definitely doesn't get talked about nearly enough as he should, because yeah, we do still have Aaron Donald and Chris Jones as the top defensive tackles in football, but Hayward is pretty close to those guys. And I think he doesn't get talked about nearly enough in that same breath. But somebody that does get talked about a lot is TJ Watt, and that's for good reason. He didn't have as good of a year this past season as he's accustomed to, but unfortunately, as is kind of becoming the case for him in his career, he was dealing with injuries, and that held him back. He had an 82 PFF grade, which is still exceptional. That was 19th among 119 edges, so it was a fantastic year still, but that was his lowest grade in the past 4 years by 7.5 points. The next lowest was an 89.6, which was 6th among all edges. And that's his second lowest year in the past 4 years, that 89.6 year. He is ridiculous. And he does it in every possible way. He is a fantastic pass rusher. He's great against the run, and he can cover in limited sample sizes as well. So he does it all. And what's really nice too is it's not just those two. They also have Alex Highsmith, who is exceptional in his own right. He ranked 25th out of all players in pressures. And here's the thing, it doesn't stop there either, because we've established that Watt and Highsmith are stars, Watt being a superstar, Highsmith just being a star. And they have a fantastic third edge rusher as well in Marcus Golden, who was 41st among pressures of all players again. So they have the top end talent, and they also have depth on the edge as well. And the interior is no slouch either, because obviously they have Cam Hayward, who's great, and Larry Ogunjobi is a really solid player as well. So they have the interior pretty well established as well. It's going to be a question of who's going to be able to step up and be their nose tackle. Last year, it was Montravius Adams, and he was not very good. And they also had Tyson Alualu, and he's no longer with the team. So if I had to bet, I would say it's probably going to be Keanu Benton, who they drafted in the second round this past season. And he's really interesting. He's a pretty solid interior pass rusher and not the greatest run defender. So he's not the most prototypical of nose tackles, but that's kind of the direction this NFL is moving lately, is just, can you stop the pass? If so, you have a spot on the team. And yeah, I wouldn't be too surprised if it's Benton. I think he makes the most sense because they did spend a high pick on him, and there's not a ton of competition for the nose tackle position. So that's probably what the interior is going to look like. I'm also interested to see how DeMarvin Leal looks, because he did not have a very good rookie year. He also didn't play hardly at all, but he's a pretty good athlete in his own right at 290 pounds. So they have a really nice and interesting rotation on the interior, and then that edge room is ferocious. And for the final part of their defensive roster, the linebacking core, it's really hard for me to get a grasp on, because I'm a big fan of Cole Holcomb. I think he's a very solid player that can cover, and he can also defend the run really nicely. So he's a good do-it-all linebacker. Landon Roberts, I'm not so high on. I think he can thump in the run game, but that's about it. I'm honestly a little bit higher, I would say, on Nick Kwiatkowski than I am Roberts, because Kwiatkowski hasn't played in 2 years now, basically at all in that span. But the last time he played any consistent amount was 2020, and he was ranked by PFF 18th out of 83 linebackers. That's really good. And that's not a fluke, because in 2019 he was ranked 15th, and that's, it starts to be a trend at that point. I think his upside is a fair amount higher than Roberts is, because you're going to have to take Roberts off the field in passing situations. With Kwiatkowski, though, even though he's not a very good athlete, he has shown in the past that he is capable of covering downfield. So I would rather have Kwiatkowski, at least until I know for sure that he's just unable to play at this point. But I understand the rationale behind Roberts. You kind of know what you're getting with him. Somebody that can defend the run and is a pretty sure tackler, but that's about it. And in this day and age, it's, in my eyes, kind of a necessity for linebackers to be able to cover downfield. And that's why I'm a little bit nervous about the prospects of their linebacking rank. I think that's probably the part of their defense I feel the worst about, because I think Holcomb, again, is very solid, but that's just one half of the puzzle right there. And there's not going to be any sort of being used to playing with each other between Holcomb and Roberts. This is the first time they're playing together, and they're both new to Pittsburgh, so they're both learning this scheme together. It's going to be a little bit tricky for them, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's not an issue for the Steelers. Lastly, the coaching component. Mike Tomlin is a very conflicting personality in the sports realm, because on one hand, he will basically single-handedly ensure that your team does not get a losing record. It is said ad nauseum, he's never had a losing season as a head coach, but there is value in that. That shows that he always keeps the locker room in check and keeps players playing hard regardless of the situation. And he's done it with poor quarterback play on the tail end of his coaching career, because be it Ben with his shot arm, or be it Trubisky and Pickett this past season, it has not always been sunshine and rainbows for Tomlin, but he's still found a way to ensure that at a minimum the team's going 500. And that's kind of where the issue lies a little bit, though, because if you're always at least okay, you're not going to have those good draft picks, and you're not going to be able to build up the team. So that is kind of an issue with always having success. But the bigger issue I have with Tomlin is that he is just so passive. He ranked 29th out of 32 coaches in aggressiveness on fourth down. And yes, I do understand you don't want to really trust the offense, but at a certain point, you're actually harming your defense by making it so much of the focus be on them, to where if this was 20 years ago, you could get by on strictly having a defense. But in the modern era, with all of the rule changes to help offenses, you have to let the offense play some. And my issue with Tomlin, too, is he meddles tremendously in the offense, to where Matt Canada is not a very aggressive offensive coordinator to begin with, and Tomlin has said that he wants him to play the game conservatively. That is an issue because, again, you're going to have to put up some points to win, and you're not going to be putting yourself in the best position to put up points if you're always scared of the turnover, or just scared of not getting 3 yards every single play, which is just not a sustainable model for an offense. In today's day and age, the big play is key, and you have a great receiver in that regard for George Pickens, who can get you the big play, but they're just reluctant to trust Pickett with getting the ball deep downfield for him. So in the end, I really don't know how I feel about Tomlin. I think he does get the most out of his players basically every year, but I do also think he's kind of coaching with one hand tied behind his back. And that's obviously an issue. In the end, Pittsburgh is a very difficult team to get a grasp on because there is just a ton of unknowns on the offense to where are they going to let Pickett cook, so to speak, and are they going to just take the leash off of him and say that it's okay to throw, more than 5 yards deep downfield? If that's the case, then 19th is far too low for the Steelers, and they are going to be several spots higher than that. If it's not, I could see them actually being a bit worse because this defense is really solid. It can be one of the best in the NFL, but if you're entrusting them with everything, that's just, again, setting yourself up for failure. So this is kind of the middle ground. I think this is the average of what they're going to be, and I think overall they're going to be a team that few teams would want to play against, but if they're going against like Kansas City, I think they're going to get boat raced, and I think their offense is just not going to be able to keep up with that great offense in Kansas City, but for the most part, they're going to be a challenge for any team they face.